Live stream. All right, good morning, everyone. We'll start. We'll begin with prayer as usual. Then we'll introduce our speaker, Deacon Josef, and then we'll go into it. So first we'll sing the Heavenly King. We'll also sing the Troparion and Hakin as well.
We'll sing both. Yeah.
So those who have the music or can attend to sing this. So we'll sing O Heavenly King first, which you know, and then if you're able to sing Nektarios, we'll sing that right after.
Heavenly King, thou comest with the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us, and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls from good ones. The offspring of Seraphim and the guardian of Aegina, the true friend of virtue who didst appear in the last days, O Nektarios, we faithfully honor thee as a dwelling servant of Christ. For thou pourest forth healings of every kind, for those who piously cry out. Glory to Christ who hath glorified thee. Glory to him who hath made thee wondrous. Glory to him who worketh healings for all who believe. Come, let us all abide with the Rossi's newly shining star, and the divine and newly budded bulwark of the Church, and in joyfulness of heart let us sing his praises. By the working of the Spirit was he glorified, and doth pour forth the abundant grace of wondrous cures. Upon them that cry, rejoice, O Father Nektarios.
Welcome everyone. It's really a joy to be having this our Nativity fast, our retreat. Years ago we have retreats often during Lent or during Nativity, and so it's this kind of hopefully restarting this tradition once again. So with that, it's my joy to introduce our speaker today, Deacon Josef Candelario, who's not a stranger to us. I got to know Deacon Josef over a decade ago. He was a student at UC Davis. I was a parishioner here at Holy Cross as well. And to see him coming into the Orthodox Church, but always having such positive spirit, so genuine, so kind, and all these wonderful qualities. So it's a joy to see where God has brought you on your journey and continuing to. After he had graduated, and by the way, he was received in the church the same Sunday as our choir director, if I'm not mistaken, Valerie. So that was kind of very, very special. Some time in San Diego, where he met his wonderful wife, Mercedes. So and then from there, they decided to kind of follow a calling to go and study theology in Thessalonica, or Thessaloniki, where he just ended up staying. It was more than I thought, almost five years it was. And earned a Master's of Theology, and in that time, his wife became very, very fluent in Greek. And they were also, as we kind of may remember, had been preparing for missionary service and discerning that. And kind of sometimes you prepare for one thing and things go another direction. And after having prepared for this, where they went to for the mission, things kind of fell apart in unexpected ways. But nonetheless, continued on in faith and regrouping. We had to do an internship in Santa Rosa, St. Seraphim's Cathedral. Within our diocese, over the past year, has been preparing for ordination to the diaconate, and then we'll be going forward to do some further studies at St. Vladimir's. I think in preparation for the next steps in the church and your service and ministry, which is a great joy. And where this retreat idea came about, we remember this past year there's this wonderful movie on St. Nektarios that had come out called Man of God. Somebody had been, the director had been inspired by one of the books of the life of this really incredible saint of the last century, Nektarios, who had been such a faithful hierarch, so much within the image of Christ. And I think that movie really touched, for those who saw it, and maybe some of you haven't perhaps seen it yet, really touched a lot of hearts with that example. And I've been aware that over the past years, Deacon Josef had been translating into English quite a good section of the works of St. Nektarios. What a wonderful opportunity to invite him to us to share, just to share some more about this saint, about his teachings, about his personality that perhaps we don't know, and kind of how, in a personal way with that. So with all that said, I hope that this will inspire you all to kind of to go forward in our Lenten struggles and beyond, or Nativity kind of fasting season. So with that, it's my joy to introduce Deacon Josef.
Thank you, Father. And thank you all of you for welcoming me and my wife back. This is my home parish. It's where it all started for me, and so I'm so happy to be back here with all of you. When Father Timothy first asked me to give a presentation on St. Nektarios' work, almost a year ago now, I was hesitant, and I told him, Father, I only translated his work. I didn't write any of it myself. What could I possibly say that would be of any interest to anyone? He said, just give us a story, a personal story, your personal connection to the saint. So I gave it some thought, gave it some prayer. I said, after 4 years of translating his work, I'm fairly certain I've spent more time with St. Nektarios than with any other author, saint or not. Unfortunately, that means also not even the Bible. So I've spent more time with him than any other author. So I better have something edifying to say about it. So I don't consider myself an expert on St. Nektarios by any stretch of the imagination. But by God's grace and by the intercessions of the saint, today I'd like to offer you my humble experience with the saint and a few of the pearls of great price I've gleaned from him over the years. And I hope that you also learn something new and are edified by it. So first of all, show of hands. Okay, Father mentioned it earlier. Show of hands, how many people here have already seen the film Man of God? Alright, so the most of you. Okay, who plans on seeing it? Great. It's actually a really well done film. Largely based on parts of the book Saint of Our Century. But like any film adaptation, the producers and the director couldn't fit everything into an hour and a half. They had to make decisions on what to present, what to cut, so that the story could have some sort of semblance of focus. Now, when my boss, the one who commissioned the translations of St. Nektarios' books, when she saw the film, she said, it did a good job of showing his humility, but I didn't think it showed his deep spirituality and theological knowledge. Right. Now, I certainly can't give you all of that in half an hour, but assuming you watch the film, I'll give you the hidden treasures about St. Nektarios that you won't get in the movie, and I'll try not to repeat things that the movie already covers. Okay? Deal? So let's start out with a little bit about his life in a nutshell. Okay? So St. Nektarios was born on October 1st, 1846, in eastern Selivria of Thrace, in what was then the Ottoman Empire. It's now in Turkey. about 75 kilometers from Istanbul. He was baptized with the name Anastasios. Now keep this in mind because I'm going to refer to him as Anastasios until he receives the name Nektarios. So he was born to a very poor family. Materially very poor, but spiritually very wealthy. They were a very pious family, and he was brought up going to the church and learning the church's teachings. Now, Anastasios only completed primary school, elementary school, because there were no schools of higher education where he lived. But nevertheless, he had a real thirst and hunger for learning. The image on the right here is a real photograph of his childhood home. On the left is kind of like it's an artist's rendering of what it would have looked like in its heyday and in color. At the age of 14, this is around 1860, he left home to find work in Constantinople, which was the capital of the Ottoman Empire at that time. So he wanted to help support his family financially and perhaps get a chance to continue his studies. Now there's a really interesting story here of how he gets to Istanbul. The fastest way isn't across land, it's by sea. And he didn't have money to pay for the boat. But for that story, for the miracle in that story, I suggest you read the book. So arriving in Constantinople, he found a job at a tobacco factory. But his experience there was not unlike, we'll say, a Charles Dickens character. Right? So he was treated very badly. He was basically exploited as a child labor. He was almost a slave. He had barely enough money for food. He didn't have enough money to replace his tattered clothes. He'd work all day, and then he would spend his evenings in prayer and in study. At the age of 20, with God's help, Anastasios found work on the island of Chios as an elementary school teacher. At the age of 30, he entered the monastery of Neamani, receiving the name Lazarus. It's kind of interesting. Anastasios was his birth name. Lazarus was his, right? So Anastasios means resurrection. Who was the first to be resurrected? Lazarus. 3 years later, he was tonsured, ordained a deacon, and given the name Nektarios. Now, a wealthy man named John Kuremis took a liking to Nektarios and sponsored him to complete gymnasium, which is the European equivalent to like a preparatory high school, right? To complete this schooling in Athens. Now remember, he's in his 30s by now, right? Completing high school. After graduating, he went to serve the church in Alexandria, where he met Patriarch Sophronius, who recognized the brilliance in Nektarios and sent him back to Athens to complete theological school, which is it's a bachelor's in theology. It's roughly equivalent to like an American MDiv. In 1885, he was ordained a priest in Alexandria, and then consecrated bishop and appointed to the metropolis of Pentapolis. So his full title is Nektarios Kephalas, Metropolitan of Pentapolis. Right? He was also appointed the preacher and secretary to the patriarch, and the patriarchal representative to Kairos. All of this is happening all at once to this guy who had an elementary school education up until a few years before, right? So people in Alexandria, the other priests and bishops noticed this, and they got jealous, and they conspired against him, slandered him, and he was suspended. Again, you can watch all of this in the movie, right? I won't go over that again with you. This forced him to move to Greece secretly in 1891, where he found no lodging, no food, no subsistence for a while. And then he became an itinerant preacher. So he had friends, right? People loved him, right? It wasn't just, these people who hated him there. A lot of people loved him, and that's part of what fed the jealousy. So he had friends in Athens who stood up for him and got him a position at Evia. The Euboeans, right? We read about that in the New Testament. Evia is the modern Greek pronunciation of it. As a preacher, okay? A couple of years later, he was appointed the director of the Rezarios Seminary, which is an ecclesiastical high school. And he stayed there for 14 years. Now, during that time, some of his spiritual daughters expressed an interest in entering the monastic life under his direction. So beginning in 1904, they acquired a dilapidated monastery on the nearby island of Aegina, and they started rebuilding it. Now, St. Nektarios did much of the manual labor and gardening himself. There's stories of people who would go there to try to find the person in charge, and they'd see this guy in like a raggedy cassock gardening, and like, oh, we're looking for who's in charge. It's like, that's me. So eventually within his lifetime, the sisterhood grew to 30 nuns. And this was at a time in Greece where monasticism was kind of at a low point, right? Like the 1970s rebirth of monasticism hadn't happened yet. And there, Aegina again, he found more slander, again, watched man of God. At the end of his life, he'd already been suffering from an intense pain for over 1.5 years before telling anyone about it. And like many clairvoyant saints, he saw his repose coming in advance. And so in preparation for his own death, he went to go venerate an icon of the Theotokos near the monastery before telling his disciples of his imminent departure. On September 20th, 1920, he was brought to hospital in Athens, where he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. And there he underwent treatment for 2 months. There's another miracle that happens here, but again, just watch man of God. On November 8th, 1920, he fell asleep in the Lord at the age of 74. And there were miracles that happened immediately surrounding his death. The hospital was filled with a pleasant fragrance. And it was such a strong fragrance that they couldn't use the room where he had reposed for any other patients. Now that room is now dedicated as a chapel to St. Nektarios. If you go to Greece, you can visit it and you can venerate, where his things there. After his body was exhumed, it was found to be incorrupt, and it exuded sweet fragrance. Finally, in 1961, he was officially recognized as a saint and glorified by the church. All right. So now I'd like to tell you a little bit about my own experiences with the saint. Now, the very first time I ever heard about St. Nektarios, was on a visit to St. John's Monastery up at Manton, where monk Nektarios, now of blessed memory, told me the story of his namesake. Now, after graduating college, I had a big decision ahead of me. Spend the money that I've been saving up since high school for this tattoo I always wanted. It's a big tattoo, I designed it myself, and it's the point where, like, at work I would just, draw it out and, kind of fantasize about having it one day. And I finally had the money for it. But I also wanted to visit Mount Athos. I couldn't do both. So, I chose for the latter. I chose to make a pilgrimage to Greece, go to Mount Athos. And when the monks at Manton found out about this, they strongly encouraged me, we'll say, to visit St. Nektarios as well while I was over there. So after Athos, I made my way south and made some friends with some backpackers I met at a hostel while I was staying in Athens. They were all secular people, and they were planning a day trip for the following day. I suggested we go to Aegina, because it's beautiful, there's beaches there, there's also ruins of an ancient pagan temple. They're like, oh yeah, let's go. It's a nice day. We get on the ferry boat to Aegina. We actually take the same bus that they're going to go to the pagan temple. I get off early so I could go to the monastery where St. Nektarios, which he founded and where his relics were kept. So it's the monastery of the Holy Trinity. It's still there and it's still got a thriving sisterhood. There I met a nun named Nektaria, which is the feminine form of Nektarios, and we chatted for a while in broken Greek and English. And then I went to the older part of the monastery where his relics used to be kept. There's a little chapel there that they actually used. This building, this was built after St. Nektarios had already reposed. So There's the older part of the monastery up there. And I found that to be a really peaceful experience, praying to the saint and just resting there, next to him. A little while later, I hear this ruckus down the hill, and I see 3 tour buses pull up. People coming out with the cameras, hanging. And I thought, well, that's my cue to leave, right? So I go down to the city bus stop. I look at the timetable, and I realize that if I wait for the next bus, I'm definitely going to miss my boat back to Athens. So I asked the guy who was waiting there, how far is the port from here? He goes, 6 kilometers. I say, in my youthful stupidity, 6 kilometers, that's a little bit more than a 5K. I can run a 5K, so 6 kilometers in 40 minutes, no problem. So I start running. Hottest time of the day, August humidity, in jeans and in sandals. Needless to say, that lasted about 10 minutes before I started walking. About 20 minutes after that, I get to a fork in the road. And just at the fork there was this little electronics store. So I pop into the shop and I ask, which way to the port? And the guy looks at me and says, what time does your boat leave? I say, about 10 minutes. He's like, how are you going to get there? I'm walking. He's like, I'll take you on my Vespa. So I hop on, and I survive this terrifying run. Has anyone here been to Greece and experienced Greek drivers? It was that, right? Getting within centimeters of passing cars and walls. And we pull up to the port there just in time for me to see my boat taking off.
Wow.
And, all of the friends I made from the hostel were already on the boat. And I turned around and said thank you. Like I tried to give the guy some money. He took time off his workday to go bring a complete stranger to the port, and he refused. Right? That's probably the first of many times that I would experience something called philotimo. Philotimo is a Greek expression which expresses a type of altruism, especially for the stranger. And oftentimes at your own personal cost. And so I'm certain that St. Nektarios' hand was definitely, in this situation, right? But it wasn't to get me to my boat on time. It was for me to experience this philotimo, which is, definitely something that he himself practiced throughout his lifetime, and he experienced in his lifetime. And definitely left his mark on his island. Okay. So, yeah, there's a picture I took while I was sweating and running to the port. Okay, now let's fast forward about 6 years. My wife and I, as Father mentioned earlier, we moved to Thessaloniki, Greece in 2016 to study Greek and to get a degree in theology. Now, we'd fundraised for this. But by this summer, after our first academic year in Greece, we were nearly broke and desperately looking for jobs, both local and remote. And I started taking just odd jobs wherever I could, including a gig ghostwriting colorful anecdotes and funny stories and jokes into Protestant sermons. So not only did I have moral qualms about this, but these types of jobs are also very inconsistent and they paid badly. And one day I was browsing orthodoxjobs.com and I saw an ad looking for a Greek to English translator by an Australian novice attached to St. George Monastery in Jerusalem's Jewish quarter. As a trial, she had me correct a very badly done translation of St. Basil's 3 ascetical homilies. Probably done by a Greek person who did not have a very good grasp of English. And when I say bad, I mean bad. Are there any children in the room? Good. Okay. So this is a screenshot I took of correcting his translation in the midst of it. It was, I don't want to linger on this too much, but you can tell it was not good. So after a couple small jobs for this nun, she asked me if I'd be interested in a bigger long-term job. That still didn't pay very well, but it was consistent and it was enough. Now, a week later, 2 20-pound boxes arrived in the mail. One of them contained the massive 8-volume set of St. Nektarios' collected works. So in Greece, they call it the blue set, which is actually not complete. They're still publishing more and more volumes, because you'll find out later he wrote a lot. So I started with this volume right here, the first volume, and just for the past 4 years, it's just continued on. So now we'll get to what I learned from 4 years of translating St. Nektarios. So, as I mentioned, it's probably the most obvious thing. St. Nektarios was a prolific writer. And when I say prolific, I mean, in the course of his lifetime, he completed 40 volumes of texts, 250 to 400 pages each. These were published into 60 books, 10 remaining unpublished. Okay. His first published book was Homilies during, 10 ecclesiastical homilies during Great Lent is the full Greek title. But Homilies during Great Lent is also fine. And what's interesting is he would write these things, get them published, and then he'd try to distribute them for free, for the benefit of the people. Now, here's the historical context for this. So this is the last quarter of the 19th century into the first quarter of the 20th century. Europe is being carried away in a spirit of revolution against the monarchy, against religious institutions. And Greece itself had just been liberated from the Ottoman yoke, somewhat stabilized by the installment of a German king, but we'll soon see that there will be revolutions against their own monarchy, their own crown. And this is not to mention the Protestant Roman Catholic theological influences on Orthodoxy in general at this time, and Greece in particular with its German Protestant kings. Right? Well, they adopted Orthodoxy, of course, but nevertheless, this Protestant spirit still entered Orthodoxy in that way. And this is also not to mention the new scientific findings that were challenging the traditional Orthodox worldview. In this context, St. Nektarios is trying to buttress true Orthodox teaching founded on the Holy Fathers and their tradition of biblical interpretation by teaching and training not only future clergy, not only the future clergy and catechists of Greece, but the population as a whole. So, as we mentioned earlier, he was also an itinerant preacher for a while, and he was masterful at this art. He was a true golden mouth. As we said, his first published book was Homilies during Great Lent, 10 ecclesiastical homilies during Great Lent, which he published as a fourth-year student while he was still a deacon at the Theological School of the University of Athens at the age of 39. He continued to preach as a bishop in Alexandria until he was exiled to Greece, and then from 1892 to 1894, he was a preacher in Evia, like we mentioned earlier. And On Care for the Soul came out of those sermons. Now, I want to share with you some gems I found in reading and translating these homilies. So from Homily 9, from his first book, he focuses on the mystery of confession. Right? So this set of homilies, they're all preached during Great Lent, of course. So confession primarily is a sacrament of the healing of our souls as a restoration of peace between God and man. And the structure of the homilies, he goes through Old Testament, New Testament examples, then the Church Fathers, then he quotes ancient Greek philosophy in the form of Socrates, and then ancient Greek poetry in the form of Hesiod. Now, this shows, of course, his belief that Christianity was the completion of ancient Greek culture and religion, and that the ancient Greek philosophers and poets were like the Old Testament to the Greek people, in the same way that, well, the Jewish Old Testament was their preparation. For the Jewish people, their own, let's say, prophets were their preparation to receive Christ. So I'll read, and this is probably too small for you guys in the back, so let me read this to you. I don't have it here. So, the words of the Lord are the dawn of the coming day and the herald of the rising of the sun, a rising beam of radiant light, who, being its herald, was sent to those in darkness and lying in the shadows. But behold, the all-radiant disk of the sun now rising from the horizon, magnificent from the foundation of the heavens, and all is made splendid in boundless light. It shines and illumines all the earth in its radiance. Creation is made anew and takes on a new life through the warm rays of the sun. The heavenly light, which illumines the noetic eyes of our souls, bestowed us with a spiritual vision by which we see clearly and discover what is truly beneficial to us amongst the things which have the semblance of good, as both the purpose and end goal of that light. Henceforth, uncovered, being atoned for by the Son of God and being adopted, we pray to God and we boldly present ourselves as sons to a Father. Being earthly, we join ourselves to the angels, and, as if in a dance, we offer divine worship to God. Now, a little bit from Homily 2. This draws focus on the royal priesthood of all believers and the duties that come from that, especially in preparation. Homily 2 of endurance in times of affliction, from the same set of homilies. He talks about God's providence for the world, that nothing happens on earth without God's will, and he gives the reason that our afflictions are so frequent and accumulative, which is this ancestral sin, and why we must patiently endure them. He says, "And so let us brave and let us endure a little, so that we might receive the joy of heaven and divine glory. Let us study the matters of the world, so that we might advance impassively. Let us hope in God, who himself healed the paralytic, and wants to help us who are suffering as well. The grace of the Lord is coming in just a little while. Let us endure a little while longer for the kingdom of heaven, for he who endures to the end will be saved." Okay, and lastly, from this second set of homilies later on in his life, it draws focus on the royal priesthood of all believers and the duties that come with that, not just for the priest, but for all of us who share this royal priesthood, especially in preparation for Holy Communion. St. Nektarios says, "Come, O Christian brothers, let us care for the salvation of our souls. The present time of the fast is especially appropriate for preparation because the fasts and compunctionate services and the absence of guilt are so many means by which we can come to repentance, the examination of our moral life, our preparation for communion. And we are not always provided with such a good opportunity. The good example set by those who commune is a strong encouragement for those who are abstaining from Holy Communion. Let us pray to Christ with all our heart, that he might strengthen us in the race which is set before us, and make us worthy communicants of his holy and immaculate body and his precious blood, so that the Eucharist might become delight, health, and joy for us, and that we might have an acceptable defense before the dread judgment seat on the fearful day of judgment. Amen." All right, so now we get to perhaps my favorite part of St. Nektarios that I discovered, is that he also dabbled is a weak word for it. He was proficient in calligraphy art, visual art. Now the only place I've seen his art, it's all collected in one book, which is called Words of Eternal Life. The publication of that book coincided with a study he did on the Precious Cross, and you'll understand why in a second. So it's a set of 208 ink pen calligraphy drawings of passages from the Bible. And if you can't see in the back, I highly suggest you come up for this, because it's a really special treat. So it's drawings of passages from the Bible and church hymnography, especially hymnography from Feast of the Cross. Now he did this for the benefit of his own soul. Remember, he was school director. He was, starting a monastery. He was spiritual father for many people. He was writing textbooks. And on top of all of his duties as the director, he would take time to draw. Right? And does anyone here like drawing or sketching? Like I do. It feeds my soul. It fed his too. And this is one way that I connect with him. But another reason he did this was to give the nuns a way to study the scriptures and keep their news concentrated, right? In a way that's also sweet and pleasant, right? So here's one of them. I'm giving you a smattering of ones that I like. I can't show you all 208 today. This is the very first one. So, Amen, Amen, I say unto you, except ye eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, ye have no life in you. It's from John 6:53. Can everyone see this? Okay. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart. I am come a light into the world. I am the way, the truth, and life. So, first part is up here. Okay, and then he starts the second part here. And here we have, many of you probably seen this. Phos and Zoe, light and life. Right? And in the shape of a cross, right? Which is the whole point of this set of calligraphy.
It's almost radiating.
It radiates out from the front.
Radiating with the light. You see how it's different radiation.
All right. This one's a little bit more on the nose. Okay, the anchor of faith. Blessed is the man that feareth the Lord, for he shall never be shaken. Rejoice, O fruitful, immortal, and life-bearing tree. Rejoice, O blossom, which has made our salvation bloom. I have to say, too, I translated this, but I used existing translations where I could, right? Like, it's hard to beat the beauty of the King James Bible. And also some of the church hymnography, which we already have. Okay. All right, now we get to St. Nektarios, the hymnographer. So St. Nektarios wrote a book called, he compiled his hymnography into a book called the Theotokos while he was a director of the ecclesiastical school, and he published it in 1907. This is unpublished, my translation is unpublished. It's a really long book. And so I'm about a little bit more than halfway through it. So you're going to get a preview here of something that's yet to be proofread or edited, so forgive any awkwardness, but you're the first to see it. So it's a collection of 152 paraliturgical hymns and 10 full canons which draw heavily from liturgical hymns to the Theotokos, such as the Salutations, also known as the Akathist, and the Supplicatory Canon, also known as the Paraklesis, and various other Theotokaria. And I say paraliturgical because they're not... Some of them are given an actual tone to be sung in, and could probably actually be used in church. But most of them, he takes liberties which, and I'll talk about this later, which you wouldn't normally see in church hymnography, such as rhyming schemes. Now, the most famous of his hymnography is, of course, Agni Parthene, right? Which we sang today. Right before communion. Is there anyone here who wasn't here for communion today? Here? I'm not going to try to out anyone. Anyway, I was going to play it for you, but you guys did such a beautiful job today during communion. It's how can you beat that, right? Is anyone here unfamiliar with what I'm talking about right now? O pure and virgin lady. Okay. So this was a hymn he wrote 100 years ago, like almost, yeah, more than 100 years ago now. But it kind of like, it stayed under the radar until I think like the 1980s when, oh, don't play, don't actually. Simona Petra Monastery. No, don't. Okay.
You can play it, it's fine. You want
Okay, I'll play like 15 seconds of it. No? Simona Petra Monastery took it and they set it to music. So, I love this version. It's my favorite monastery of the monasteries I've been to on Athos. I feel like it's a second home to me. And we'll stay with you, so I'm married, so I can't actually go there. But as a monk, if I were to, that would be it. And they have such a beautiful. Well, first of all, they're some of the best church musicians, I think, to this day. This is such a wonderful tradition of Orthodox liturgical music, and so it's fitting that they were the ones to set this hymn to music. And it's not exactly Byzantine chant; it's definitely Byzantine in form, but it's got more of a Western feel to it. Greensleeves is I think what we'd be most familiar with in the West. Since then, so this translation also is not mine. This is Bishop Basil of Wichita, right? It's another one of those things. It's like, why am I going to retranslate this one hymn, like this hymn, when it's already got such a beautiful English translation? And so, since the monks set it to music, it's been translated into many different languages: Slavonic, Romanian, Arabic, French. And it's reached so many people in the world, and even though it's para-liturgical, I mean, we heard it during the liturgy today, right? And so we already see this movement of taking some of St. Nektarios' hymns, and it's becoming more and more regularized. When I was teaching English in Prague, in the Czech Republic, the cathedral in Prague would play this while they were giving out the absolutions during the liturgy. They'd play it, they would sing it. Right. Now, I want to share with you other things that you might not be familiar with. Okay. So, well, first of all, let's talk a little bit about what his hymnography reveals. One of the things, it's a deep and enduring devotion to the Theotokos. He also has an incredibly broad and thorough mastery of the Greek language. Now, what I mean by that is, okay, so I would be translating along, and then I'd get to these, it's like someone plowing a field, right, and then you hit a rock, like a big boulder, and you don't know how to get around it. And so I get stuck in certain parts. Like, I don't know what he's trying to say here. And so I bring it up with my Greek tutor, we look at it together, and he's like, oh, that's because he's using Homer, right? And he'd use these, these ancient forms of Greek, and especially in metrical style, like things that, like, I'm not a genius in any sense of the word, right? I'm not very intelligent, so like, I can't just recognize, like metrical patterns and stuff. But my Greek tutor is, and so he's like, yeah, he's using this and that, and which is, it blows my mind because again, he had an elementary school education until the age of 30, right? But he was just so gifted by God. And he gave all of his gifts back to God, right? That's something that we see. Another thing I learned from translating him is he was, yes, he would use ancient Greek and even, like medieval liturgical Greek styles, traditional hymnographical styles, but he was also open to some newer things like rhyming hymnography. That's something that comes into the West probably after the Middle Ages, at least in the church music, definitely with the Anglican Church. But he was, he was okay with using it, and so you see rhyming schemes, and it's probably kind of small for you guys to see. I'll read you the first tropario here. Animnon megalinos e achande, to genos imon megalinasan. Disopon disopose paninite, ke ai tonion disopisasan. Right, so it's an A-B rhyming scheme, which is not something you see like very often in Greek hymnography or poetry. My translation on the right here is, in hymns do I magnify you, O Immaculate One, for you have magnified our human race. I fervently plead with you, O Allotted One, to ever plead with your Son on our behalf. It doesn't rhyme. I took enough liberties with trying to make it flow well in English. I didn't want to sacrifice meaning to try to shoehorn in a rhyming scheme in English. But it's still like interesting to see, right? Okay. So that being said, it is still a work in progress. Like I said, a little bit more than halfway done translating through the hymns of the Theotokos, but it's been a joy to spend this time with the saint, but also to join with his love and devotion and praise of the Mother of God. And like I said, who knows, maybe as the years go on, more of his hymnography will eventually be set to music and enjoyed by more and more people, the same way that the Agni Parthenia has taken off in recent decades. So, I know that's a lot, I've thrown at you all at once, but I hope some of it sticks and that you were blessed by St. Nektarios. Any questions?
Thank you.
Questions?
I just have a quick question. I know in the movie, and I think in the book too, did St. Nektarios ever become a Greek citizen again? Or was he ever a Greek citizen? Because when he was going for the job,
Right, that was an
"You're not
issue.
a Greek citizen." He goes, "What? I'm not Greek."
You know, that's a good idea. That's a good question.
I never found it.
He had Greek ancestry, and I know from living there, if you have Greek ancestry, it's fairly easy to get Greek citizenship.
Oh,
And
okay.
because at the end of it, he retired, right? He retired from teaching at the school, and then he got a pension, which would lead me to believe that at some point he got Greek citizenship and was able to receive a pension that way.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Other questions?
Had you studied Greek before you went to learn it in Greek?
Tiny bit. So my wife and I took weekly, like once a week, lessons from a Greek grandmother from one of the churches down in San Diego. But like when we got there, we're like, oh man, we know nothing. Like, we had no idea what's going on. So it was really just 4 hours a day, 5 days a week for an academic year. And then we're like, okay, we can understand people. And then I entered the master's program, and I was like, I have no idea what's going on. And another year later, I was like, okay, now I can kind of function at an academic level. Sorry.
Yes, I can't remember how many years from St. Nektarios passing to the exhuming of his body to prove the incorruption.
1920, was it? 1920, 21, he reposed 1961.
Okay.
He was, what the interesting thing is though, the Church of Alexandria, it was some years after that, I think it was like into the 70s, where the Church of Alexandria lifted their, what's it called? He was under like a canonical
Discipline?
discipline, right?
Yeah.
So they lifted. He was, what's it called when you're in school and this suspension? He lifted his suspension and formally apologized for the injustice done to him. Like the 70s, right? And this all happened to him like towards the end of the 19th century, right? So another way that he sort of resembles like John Chrysostom, right? And a lot of the saints who faced injustice in their life. And there was another question.
Yeah, I got one. With your knowledge of Greek now, do you find, like, do you question translation, like when you're reading the Gospels or whatever? Do you look and say, oh, I think that could be done differently, or do you approach general reading the Bible differently now?
Reading the Bible, okay. I would say that I'll look at both. Our biblical translations are fairly good, right? But what you don't see if you're only looking at a translation is sort of a spectrum of meaning in the words. Okay, and so I'll read through that just so I can sort of understand, okay, like this could also mean this, or this is a broader meaning than what we're getting from this one English word. I do this more with hymnography, like sort of scrutinizing, because a lot of our hymnography now, it hasn't had, like they haven't had like the, I guess, the intense scrutiny that the biblical translations have had. And also, like, what we try to do in English is you try to fit things, you know, into a metrical style. And when you do that, inevitably, you sort of move away from the meaning, from the literal meaning of things, right? But at the same time, though, like, when I was an Orthodox Christian in America, I spent very little time in the choir and actually reading through hymnography. When I was in Greece, I spent all of my time in the choir. And so, like, coming back into the English-speaking world, like, I'll hear something like, that's not what it means. Or like really, is that how you would translate that? You know, because I'm more used to the Greek original, you know, than I am with the English. It's, you know, I'm getting more and more used to the English now, but that's still part of my thinking process.
I think for having read through so many of his homilies and his works, I've noticed with some saints, sometimes they have like a favorite theme they keep coming back to, or kind of, we say if there's really, you could sum up with one message that maybe he was really trying to tell his flock of the day that perhaps we could hear, you could say what might it be? Sometimes you feel with some saints there's the call to repentance, the call to humility, the call to remember something about God or himself. Do you feel like, having covered so much of his works, that there's something like a certain theme or message that you feel like really kind of resound throughout St. Nektarios' works and things?
Yeah. So I think that so he wrote a lot of textbooks. He was a director of a school, which meant that a lot of my translations were sort of dry academic theological things, and I'd come across passages where, like, I've translated this before. Like, am I going crazy, or is this deja vu? And I would say that one thing that he tried to emphasize as much as possible is the freedom of man. What I mean by that is that man being created according to the image and likeness of God also is created with this self-motivation, with this free agency. And he tried to emphasize that, and he used that to build upon, like, talking about repentance, or talking about the sacraments, or whatever. That was the basis. And I think part of the reason he does that is because, like I said, there was this strong Western influence from the Roman Catholic Church, from the Protestants, both of which, in his eyes, and maybe there's some truth to this, sort of denigrated the free will of man, right? In trying to exalt God's providence. Like, St. Nektarios believed in God's providence, but in synergy with man's free will, right? And so you have these Roman Catholic and Protestant missionaries coming in, teaching different things, you know, to the Greek people, and he's writing things in response to them. And that just comes out, I guess, in his just normal writings, eventually.
Yeah, no, this is a beautiful one. I just, having opened your books and read a little bit almost at random for the quote in the bulletin this week, it's just to share about that idea. I think having come out of, it's a Greece not long ago, had their freedom, that independence, what does that mean? I don't know if you saw this in our bulletin, but I share this one of your, with the quotes from one of your books. It says, moral freedom is true freedom because it is not forced and is independent. For he who is morally free thinks, wills, and acts freely. The mark of moral freedom is moral independence, goodness, chastity, modesty, courage, strength, unyieldingness, self-control, and self-agency. He who is morally free is arrayed with all the virtues. While living on earth, he manifests the image of his divine Creator, whose beauty he bears in himself. But the mark of false freedom is the love of the law of sin, moral dependency, moral captivity, vice, guilt, blindness, and arrogance, and the rest of the vices that weigh down mankind. Oh, how great is the difference between these two! How beautiful is true freedom. So I think perhaps would make well for a quote from St. Nektarios. Thank you so much. Any last question before we go?
I have a couple questions. One is a quick one. Is there any writings or anything that exist of direct conversations between St. Nektarios and any of these missionaries?
No. So there aren't really like dialogues.
Okay.
But you can kind of see like what he's experienced and what he's seen by what he's responding to. Because he'll say that like the Protestants will say this, but we as Orthodox will say this. But the Roman Catholics will say this, but we believe this.
Okay.
Right.
My other quick question also, I know it was towards the end of his life and he was suffering, but do you know, like, have you come across any of what he said about what was going on with like World War I? And, the Soviet Revolution and all that?
So he writes about revolutions in general earlier in his career. But like I said, I think he kind of saw this trend happening in Greece too. Like they weren't all too happy with their German kings, and in the Balkans in general, obviously, right? That's how World War I started, right? In the Balkans, you had these movements towards nationalism and anti-monarchy, and he wrote about these things and in how I guess in Orthodox obedience, like a monarch is sort of an image of the monarchy of Christ, right? And he writes against this sort of revolutionary spirit, and we need to be obedience to the church, obedience to our rulers. So, like, I do think that he saw this coming, right?
Well, thank you again very much. This has been a really, I think. I've learned a lot about St. Nektarios, and I really was, I think, so touching to hear your personal reflections and experience on that. So let's give Deacon Josef another. We're grateful you took the time to prepare this and to come. Before we conclude, a couple of notes. We do have some, not all of them. We have some of the books available that Deacon Josef has translated that are available for $16 from our bookstore. I think there may also be an icon or two of St. Nektarios or others in the back. We'll have some more refreshments. If anyone wants another cup of coffee to stay, of that afterwards as well. Another thing you noticed, I mentioned there was going up to St. Vladimir Seminary to continue studies. Hopefully the parish can continue in some ways to support them. One of the ways which you may have seen in the bulletin email is that a generous person is helping them to get a new vehicle to get across the country and to have while they're there. So we're doing kind of a matching fund to help the Candelarios get some good, reliable transportation and all. So that's something to be in mind. We'll continue to pray for you.
Thank you so much.
And I think that's. We'll close with the prayer. I think we'll pray. It's truly meet, and then I can anoint you all. If you'd like to come forward, we have holy oil from the Rose of St. Nektarios. But we can anoint you before you leave as well.
Thank you.
We'll sing It's Truly Me to conclude our retreat today. It is truly me,
mystery of Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, the Mother of God, more honorable than the cherubim, and
God the Word, true Theotokos.